The modern concept of science supposes a confidence that knowledge can be expanded in any direction. It appears that the complexity of the IT environment challenged too much this notion of linear expansion, and it determined the resurgence of some psychological outlooks that resemble the ethos of specific Abrahamic religions. What makes them successful in this environment is that they take in consideration a non-linear complexity and that they do not aspire to develop an ecosystem of knowledge as control of the situation over everything. The specific ways in limiting the coverage of their structure of knowledge make them cope better in such an environment. The original Microsoft concept under Bill Gates works with something similar to the Christian model of making the difference between the visible hardware and the psychological power of the software, like in render unto Caesar things that belong to Caesar and unto God things that belong to God. Its business model is based on just developing an operating system with additional applications as a functional ecosystem of software amid a huge complexity. This limitation simplifies a lot the task of sustaining an ecosystem of coherence. The usual human impulse is to not pay much attention to the difference between God's software and Caesar's hardware, even less to much more valuable perspectives you may have when you are not so focused necessarily on controlling the hardware and how much gain you can have by spurring other people to create hardware. Additionally, the expansion tactics of Microsoft look like textbook Christian conversion methods with their embrace, extend, extinguish approach. They continue something like the original approach of Jesus by embracing other people's psychological software and extending it with unexpected perspectives that those people did not know how to integrate in their own thinking processes. This was creating internal interoperability problems, leading to the phase in which their own beliefs were extinguished and they had to rely on the belief in Jesus' coherence. They were resigning themselves to the idea that only Jesus knew how the overall coherence made sense. The initial embracing phase appears as relinquishing control, but this is only to get you under much tighter vendor lock-in control. It was not so much about imposing directly a specific software on other people, but a surreptitious change in the standards with some proprietary extensions that those people did not know how to work with. And Jesus was able to do this by simplifying drastically his relation to the complexity of life when giving up any practical hardware aspirations in real life. In his ministry years, he did nothing practical in terms of social organization. He was commenting on the sideline, but he was not really into assuming organizational responsibilities and projecting a practical alternative administration. He stayed clear of all the complexity unleashed by involvement in practical administration that the politicians tend to be so aware of. He was just exhorting a supposedly seamless ideal software and hardware integration that is to come in the future. He was leaning on that plateau in the mind of that seamless future as a stable base for a sense of organization able to sustain a more fluid, multi-track thinking with unexpected angles at the present tense. The other people were too caught in real-life hardware issues to sense how Jesus was operating. The Windows ecosystem works in the idea of such a seamless software and hardware integration, and it can keep some appearances of coherence in such a complexity by staying away from assuming full responsibilities. In this manner, it can have a much more fluid and versatile approach to the concept of software, which is so necessary in the IT environment, in which you don't go too far if you have a linear thinking with a rather static, self-centered organization. However, it achieves this feat by still keeping some appearances of overall organization as in a more typical static human psychological outlook. It does not really have groundbreaking ideas to create a new fluid sense of organization adequate to this complex environment. And when problems appear, they can be presented as not stemming from their own responsibilities. In moments of reckoning with such practical issues, the Windows platform can even be presented as a savior. It accumulated and assumed the sins of its relations with the hardware and with the applications, so it dies and resurrects afresh, cleaned of all those sins. Apple, on the other hand, has such a structurally Muslim approach. It works with something similar to the Islamic model of the walled garden of the land of Islam versus the rest of the world. They are not so much interested in embracing what is not under their control beyond the walls. They focus on a piece of psychological area where they feel in control of the situation, and thus they can keep things simple to create a well-tuned cohesion between God's software and Caesar's hardware. The Apple ethos has some awareness of the non-linear complexity of the world, and it grows around the perception that it is much easier to keep the things simple in a walled garden, where the scope of that complexity stays more manageable. Within this walled garden, you can develop a well-optimized integration of software and hardware while letting unfold in your mind that psychological fluidity that lets you think beyond the existing trodden paths. Islam is a holistic approach to life that gives you a sense of clarity and valuable psychological fluidity, showing you a coherent, simple and decluttered view in a complex world. However, it is so holistic exactly as a result of keeping things simple in a psychological walled garden. This is the kind of experience Apple offers to its customers. Its products have a simple, uncluttered beauty, and they work well due to the focus on optimizing the integration between software and hardware. This psychological experience is also the main expansion tactic. They are not so much interested in embracing what is not under their control beyond their walled garden in order to create software interoperability issues. People are attracted with this refreshing, uncluttered simplicity that takes them out of the trodden paths in their minds. However, this also means that they entered in a walled garden, and if they want to continue this experience, they have to stay within that garden and keep buying products there. Microsoft and Apple, as reflections of the Christian and Islamic outlooks, are about an older Abrahamic mindset, from the period when the Jewish worldview was like an ecosystem of meaning conceived as the bearer of an abyssal truth amid a huge unknown. The rabbinical Jewish approach that grew after the divergent evolutions of Christianity and Islam has a more direct gaze into the complexity of the world. It realizes that the classical human concept of truth is not so linear and it needs deeper investigation. This turns into a study of a variety of perspectives within the psychological ecosystem in one's mind, and also into investigations about the huge complexity beyond it. Google and Facebook work with this rabbinical Jewish model of facing the complexity of the world and of noticing the relevant information and connections. They have a clear idea that you can't just rely directly on an existing static psychological ecosystem to do that. Their specific approach turned into realizing that a psychological ecosystem and the unknown beyond it require different approaches. If you pay attention to what is beyond, namely the Google approach, then you need to have a clear mind, minimalistic about your own point of view, in order to really be relevant in facing its fluid complexity. If you pay attention to the psychological ecosystem, namely the Facebook approach, then you should have some sense that you are just swimming in a bubble of meaning with some internal coherence. This approach works with the awareness that such an ecosystem is largely a psychological construct. Thus, it can sustain in the same framework a concomitant unfoldment of a variety of points of view in human connections with some overall coherence. Something like, for example, the Yahoo concept reflects a more typical human approach to the organization of the mind and to its quest into the unknown. Initially, it developed as an arborescent accumulation of relevant information about the world beyond one's ecosystem. However, such an arborescent organization, while it has its value in lots of circumstances, may reflect too much one's existing psychological ecosystem if used directly to organize the unknown. Consequently, it may not really be able to take in consideration the huge amount and array of perspectives growing exponentially on the internet. As Google started to have success with its search engine, Yahoo too adopted this approach, but it still could not stay on top of the situation. The focus was still on the psychological ecosystem in one's mind as a starting point. Besides the search engine option, it grew into a portal of everything. Not that such a concept is wrong in itself, but the specific Yahoo approach was more like a self-centered joy of bathing in a huge amount of information while feeling like being in control of the situation. This was also reflected in how they thought to make a profit. Yahoo relied on banner ads, which was incentivizing them to keep the people as long as possible on their website as some sort of portal, as in a classical human self-centered perspective. An essential idea for the Google model to function was to insert targeted advertising on top of search results in order to make it profitable. It is the kind of thinking you can have when you are not self-centered. You don't necessarily see the world as a growth from the center of yourself. You notice possibilities for profit as a more fluid immersion. This difference in business models was also determining the fact that Yahoo search results tended to prioritize their own interests, while the Google results were prioritizing what matters to the user. Furthermore, the Yahoo concept of a portal did not really face the gist of what such a huge amount of information supposes for a human mind, and it increasingly looked like a confused mind when compared to the simplicity of the Google start page and its overall sense of clarity, mission and direction. Google too grew after a while beyond its initial search engine in all kinds of directions, but it continued with that genuine gaze into the non-linear unknown of the complexity of real life. It has plenty of failures among its specific endeavors, but the system can absorb that for the moment, while some of the initiatives are successful, as a result of the immersive approach to a multidimensional fluid information. It was not a self-centered growth like a progressive expansion of a spider web. In general, the companies that found a success formula in the IT environment appear to have realized that they should not just go with a more typical concept of scientific quest, as an Yahoo type of self-centered progressive expansion, and that they need to take into account a huge amount of non-linear, multidimensional information. The specific ways they managed to do this were by creating psychological structures with some limitations around the concept of a self-centered worldview, which resemble a lot the outlook of specific Abrahamic religions. Other success stories in relation to the huge amount of information of this relatively new IT field are based too on some realizations around this issue. Think also of the conceptual difference between Yahoo as that initial web directory and Wikipedia. Both have a categorization structure and a main page, but for Yahoo this had the main centralizing organizational role as the starting point. At Wikipedia they are somewhere in the background with a rather secondary derivative role that grows organically, while the topic of interest itself is at the forefront. The concept is focused on thinking directly about the topic you are interested in and on exploring how it relates to anything else. In this manner, the centering of the focus is much more mobile, natural and consequential. The mind is much more able to be fluid and relevant in relation to real life, to notice unexpected different angles, and thus the organizational structure is much more able to restructure itself, unlike when a central control of the situation proposed as knowledge is put at the forefront. Yahoo's sense of organization was too stifling for a huge amount of information, and withered, while that of Wikipedia experienced such a flourishing exactly because of dealing with a huge amount of information. Something like Yahoo works well for a small amount of information, and it can continue to be relevant for such contexts. Additionally, Wikipedia has a clear idea about limiting its scope to only synthesizing relevant and notable information and not stepping into producing original research. This also stems from being realistic about the limits of a self-centered perspective while not having groundbreaking ideas beyond it. Another similar example is how Jeff Bezos developed Amazon with an approach that tends to look like moving backwards, with a reverse timeline when compared to a more traditional one. It starts from the envisaged launch and press release, and from there the relevant information grows much more naturally, with a much more refreshed and relevant approach, freed to some extent from the self-centered view. Notice also the realism about the capacity to process lots of information at once, with a preference for small teams in the same vein of the ability on Wikipedia to tackle reasonable amounts of information that is nevertheless organically interconnected in multiple directions with lots of other information. Both Wikipedia and Amazon find some sui generis ways to get around the traditional human outlook that tends to start from a self-centered perspective, which can grow too stale and irrelevant when exposed to too much information. They have the Christian reliance on a plateau of an ideal fulfillment in the future, which frees the mind to think more fluidly about the present. Amazon's task goes in the opposite direction when compared to that of Microsoft, as it is not about providing people with the organization of an ecosystem capable of facing the fluid, multidimensional, complex future in the IT environment. Instead, it is about facing the fluid psychological abyss of the present tense, while the mind relies on the plateau of an ideal future. thus able to fulfill the people's wishes like the most efficient and practical application of a future ideal Jesus that you can have in real life at present tense. This supposes some sense about how to be immersive with the mind clinging to that ideal future, accept something abyssal about your sense of self and not just orientate around a static ego. The original experience, instead of freeing the mind, is more like clinging to an ideal future because of being immersed in an abyssally fluid present tense and not knowing what to do about it. You can start organizing things with goals first, reverse timeline and small teams, but it will be the same stale linear thinking if the gist is not sensed. Amazon also uses the embrace, extend, extinguish technique as an empathetic immersion beyond a self-centered perspective by noticing business models that work well on its platform in order to copy them and take over the respective niches. As for Wikipedia, it works by being upfront about the fact that they do not step into organizational territory, which frees the mind to just synthesize in a more dynamic manner the existing huge amount of relevant information, as a present tense Jesus universe that can explain you in the most immersive way the complexity of the world. Both Amazon and Wikipedia give up on the idea of being psychologically invested in that ideal future, of already being there to some extent, while the mind is still orientating around it as the only relevant plateau of stability in the mind. With the experience accumulated along centuries of practical application of Christianity in real life, they just watch it from the present tense context, which reflects the mind back to the present tense. In this manner, they can think fluidly at present tense about how to make the best of the existing situation, with the mind leaning on that idea of an ideal future. This also means that such models do not work in contexts that require the leadership of keeping some coherence while moving things forward in time, like the role of the Windows operating system of Microsoft. They are about saving you in the present tense, but not so much about atoning for your sins that appear as a result of the complex unfoldment of time. The modern concept of science thrives too on self-limitation, but it is more about specializations in specific fields within an arborescent ecosystem of meaning that is under impression it can expand in any direction. These Abrahamic self-limitations with universal vocation are more about being aware of a huge fluid non-linear complexity and not knowing what to do about that. Hence, they end up resorting to some limitations of their coverage in order to be able to sustain some relevant sense of organization. They really work to some extent with that non-linear complexity, and at times the results of the organization they provide may look baffling to the layman thinking in linear terms. Notice how they appear in informal speech expressions like, "It was the decision of the algorithm gods." Obviously, the self-limitations of these success stories in the IT field are not necessarily the ultimate solutions in dealing with a huge informational complexity. Especially the non-Jewish ones are more like ways to get around the issues while keeping the appearances of a self-centered competence, which is also the enabler of Christianity and Islam turning into successful universal religions. Google and Facebook turn too into some IT sui generis Jewish approaches with universal appeal by tackling each of them only one side of the situation. The original Jewish outlook is about facing everything, but this also means staying small for the current lack of adequate psychological tools relevant for such a hardcore approach. If anything, the success enabled specifically by such self-limitations shows structural problems in the way the typical human sense of self relates to the complexity of the world. Once you are aware of it, you can't help wondering how to really relate to the huge non-linear unknown of the world. And this can probably open all kinds of valuable psychological avenues.